Earlier, I spoke with the former U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs, Tim Adams. Tim was at the Treasury when China ended the dollar peg back in 2005, and he's now the managing director at the Washington-based economic advisory firm, the Lindsey Group. And I started off by asking him if Tim Geithner was being hard enough on China.
Well, I think Secretary Geithner did about the best he could, given that we're just weeks away from highly polarized midterm elections, and the country still suffers from 9.5% unemployment, and China is seen as a source of some of these economic concerns. So I think he was more aggressive than he has been in the past, but it was a very tough act to pull off given the highly charged political environment in Washington these days.
Were you surprised by the tough talk from the Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner? He says he's not arguing for patience, and he says that Chinese officials have not lived up to their international commitments, and he might even look at proposed trade sanctions in legislation.
Right. No, it's not too surprising. The last 2 or 3 Treasury secretaries have gone before the Congress and testified. They've said similar things, and after a while, it's pretty tough to say something new, and sometimes you just have to turn up the volume. Again, it's a really highly political environment in Washington right now, and economic concerns are across the country. And I think to say anything other than he's disappointed or frustrated would be a kind of off key or out of tune with what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, Tim, we do have these midterm elections taking place in November, and when push comes to shove with politicians, do you think the Treasury and Tim Geithner will have to be forced to basically label China as a currency manipulator in the semi-annual report, which has been pushed off?
Right. Well, they certainly don't operate in a political vacuum. They hear the same concerns and complaints that others hear. I hope that they choose to do the right policy outcome rather than the right political outcome. And, Tim's an old technocrat. He's a good economist, and I think they'll do the right thing. But there is a risk of citation, and there is a risk of legislation, certainly if not in the waning days of this Congress, then as we move into a new Congress next year, which may look very different from the current Congress.
And Tim, what exactly is the right policy move here right now? What do you do about a country that only moves its currency on its own timetable?
Well, you don't have many tools bilaterally. You could engage in a trade war, but I wouldn't counsel that, and I think you ultimately end up producing more harm than whatever benefit you think you might have generated. Personally, I think we've got to continue working through the international forum, through the G-20 political avenue, through the G-20 summit. We've got the Seoul summit coming up in November, and through the IMF and its role as an international arbiter of these issues. Those are the two right forum. Obviously, if we can't produce the kind of results that we need using those instruments, then we may have to think about other options. And I think what you heard from Tim today was, Secretary Geithner, was a real frustration in the lack of options.
Are we on a collision course for a trade war between the U.S. and China? What does that mean for retaliation? We had Stephen Roche, the former Asia chairman of Morgan Stanley, and also the former chief economist at this investment bank, saying that in retaliation, what about China selling off their U.S. treasuries? Don't forget, China is the biggest banker to U.S. debt right now. Right.
Well, I hope we're not heading for a trade war, given the calamitous kind of economic conditions that we've suffered through over the last 3 years to this global crisis, and given the fragility of the global recovery and here in the U.S., I think it would be a disastrous move to begin a trade war. We need to look for ways to cooperate bilaterally, but globally at open markets, not closed markets. I don't know how the Chinese would respond. I assume not well. I'd be surprised if they use treasuries as a weapon. They have a vested interest in treasuries maintaining their value, given the size of their holdings. But I'm certain that the Chinese would not find a trade sanction, a broad-based trade sanction based on the currency. I'm sure that they would probably act with great displeasure.